Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Wife didn't follow up as one of the nonprofits attached a special video. Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy watching it. One day, just before noon, I heard the distinctive sound of a message arriving on my phone. Up until that moment, it had been a typical Monday. I run a mid-sized consulting firm that I've built from the ground up over the past 20 years, now employing about 50 people with plans for expansion in the near future. As usual, I was sitting at my desk, sorting through morning paperwork. Then my personal phone chimed, which was unusual. Only a select few people have that number: my wife, my 2 children, and a few close friends. They know not to use it unless it's urgent. So I looked at the message closely and read it with interest. "Dan, I sent you a letter that you need to see in private. Sorry. Alone." Those words gave me a slight chill. It was confusing, unsettling, and definitely not like Jason. I knew I had to see this letter right away. I pressed the button on my phone to call Barbara, my personal assistant, and instructed her to hold all calls and visits for a while. I opened my personal email and saw a video attached. When I clicked on it, I was shocked by what I saw. On the screen was one of my closest friends, looking devastated. "Hi, my name is Jason Andrews. Everyone who sees this video will probably know me, but maybe not later. What I'm about to say will cause pain and suffering to a lot of innocent people, and I'm really sorry. But I'm also in so much pain that it's the only thing I can think about right now." Jason broke into tears before reaching for the mouse in front of him. He looked disheveled, like he had just woken up, and his voice carried deep sadness and confusion. I was baffled. What had happened since Saturday, when we played golf together? Sure, he seemed distracted then, but not like this. The video resumed, and it was clear that some time had passed. Jason had stopped crying but still looked incredibly upset. "Sorry about that," he said with a sad smile, pausing as he gathered his thoughts. "I have a little story to tell. About 2 months ago, I discovered that my wife, Sarah Andrews, was cheating on me with her boss, Claire Somerville. Yes, it turns out my wife of 14 years, the mother of our 2 beautiful children, has been involved with Claire for God knows how long." The pain in Jason's voice was palpable, and once again, he was overcome with emotion before the screen cut to a slideshow of images. There was Sarah, his wife, and Claire, together in a series of affectionate moments. I sat in stunned silence. My friend's wife and her boss, 2 people I knew, sharing what was clearly an intimate connection. Jason reappeared on screen, trying to maintain his composure. I wish that was all," he stammered before more sobs followed. The screen cut to another scene, one that would stay with me forever. There was Claire and Sarah in an even more intimate moment, and then, unexpectedly, another figure entered the room. It took just a second for me to recognize him: Derek Wilson, my married CFO and legal counsel. They were all involved. As the scene unfolded, I was shocked not only by what I was seeing but by the realization that these were people I knew well. My thoughts briefly flashed to the morning meeting, where all 3 of them had been present, along with others from our team. I recalled the tension in the room, the way they barely spoke to each other. At the time, they had brushed it off as a personal disagreement. Clearly, things were far more complicated than I had imagined. The video returned to Jason, who was now completely overwhelmed. "The person I loved more than anything in this world," he sobbed. "My love, my life, turned into something so ugly. It's like everything I knew has been destroyed." His tears turned to anger, and I could see the pain morphing into rage. As I watched this strong, proud man crumble, I felt my own emotions rising. I was furious. I wanted to walk out of my office right then and go confront both of them, starting with Derek. But first, I reached for my phone. Why hadn't I done this sooner? I tried to call Jason, but his cell was off, and his home phone went straight to voicemail. Just then, there was a knock at the door. "Not now, Barbara," I said through gritted teeth. "I need a little more time alone." "Sorry, Mr. Whitaker," she said hesitantly, "but the sheriffs are here, and they insist on meeting with you." "Sheriffs?" I asked, bewildered. "What do they need?" I turned off the video and was startled to see Jason staring back at me from the screen, looking utterly drained and broken. What shocked me even more was the glass in his hand. Jason never drinks. "I'm sorry for what I had to do," he said softly. "I'm sorry for hurting people who don't deserve it. I hope you can understand and forgive me." The video ended, leaving me with a deep sense of dread. What did it all mean? This was worrying, very worrying. I walked to the door and opened it to find 3 officers standing at Barbara's desk, each holding folders, their expressions serious. I recognized 2 of them. I'd seen them at several gatherings at Jason and Sarah's house. Jason's sister, Elizabeth, was married to one of the officers, Brad, and we'd crossed paths at a few events. Jason was well known for his charitable work, particularly for children with cancer, organizing events like softball games and races. Kids adored him, and Jason had a way of making everyone around him feel at ease. It was impossible not to love the guy. "Mr. Daniel Whitaker?" the lead officer asked. He knew who I was, so why the formalities? "You know who I am." "We've met before, John," I said, puzzled. "Sorry, Daniel." "Procedure," he replied, handing me an envelope. I took it, shock and confusion on my face. Before I had time to process it, the officer asked, "Can you direct us to Mrs. Somerville, Mr. Wilson, and Mrs. Andrews?" The last name was almost spat through clenched teeth. I heard Barbara gasp. When I looked up, I saw her wide eyes and surprised expression. Fortunately, Barbara was always professional and discreet, so one look from me was enough to remind her to stay calm and focus. She quickly lowered her head, pretending to work. I received another message on my phone, another apology from Jason. By now, I had a pretty good idea of where this was headed, so I led the officers toward their offices, signaling for them to follow. I passed by a bewildered Sarah, who was sitting at her desk, and almost knocked Claire's office door off its hinges as I barged in. "Claire Somerville," I said coldly. One of the officers entered and approached her as I walked out and headed toward Derek, who looked equally puzzled. Another officer followed. "Derek Wilson," I said with disdain. The urge to punch him was overwhelming, but I held back. John, meanwhile, was left with Sarah, who looked confused and alarmed by what was unfolding. Naturally, other employees began to take notice, but as soon as they saw the expression on my face, they quickly scattered. I realized I was breathing heavily and sweating, not from exhaustion but from the sheer intensity of the anger I hadn't felt in a long time. I briefly recalled an incident a few years ago when a drunk sales rep grabbed my wife at an event. He'd quickly regretted that move. A small, grim smile crossed my face as I remembered how grateful my wife had been afterward, and how that night had ended. I shook off the memory and focused on the present. Claire and Derek's office doors were now closed. John stood menacingly over Sarah, who was sobbing uncontrollably. On the screen in front of her was the same video I had just seen. When the most painful part of the video began, Sarah let out a sound like a wounded animal. John spoke in a low, stern voice as he removed Sarah's hands from her face and made her look at the screen. "Keep watching. Look at what you've done to one of the best people I know. He loved you with everything he had. Look at his agony." Sarah babbled apologies, insisting it wasn't what it seemed, that it didn't mean anything, that she only loved Jason, and only Jason, forever. But I was completely numb at that point, watching the scene unfold before me. John gave Sarah a long, withering look before coldly stating, "Sarah Andrews, it's been handed to you." She let out another anguished cry and almost collapsed. John stood there, unflinching, until she looked back at him. Then he added, "This is a restraining order. You are not allowed within 100 meters of your home, your husband, or your children. You are not permitted to contact them, except through your lawyer. The full details are in the order I'm now handing over to you. Do you understand these terms, Mrs. Andrews?" Sarah was nearly hysterical, and John had to repeat the question several times before she could respond. As all of this was happening, I could hear voices, shouts, sobs, and muffled sounds coming from the 2 offices behind me. I could only imagine what was happening there. Later, I learned that the officers with Claire and Derek had also made them watch the same video, serving them with legal documents for trespassing and breach of contract. The officers also explained their marital situations and confirmed that the same videos had been sent to their respective partners. John came up to me and spoke quietly, asking if we could suspend the three involved without pay until their legal issues were resolved, ensuring the couple would be in a better financial position in court than if they were still employed. Why allow them to continue hurting those they've betrayed? He asked. John smirked. Sir, would you like us to help escort these employees off the premises while you handle the internal investigation? We were joined by 2 other officers and 2 senior managers, both looking upset and confused. I glanced at the 3 employees standing in front of me, feeling detached, like I could no longer see them as people. You 3 have been suspended without pay, effective immediately, for alleged violations of the company's code of conduct and ethics. You have 2 minutes to gather any personal items from your work areas, after which you will be escorted out by these officers, who have kindly volunteered to assist. You must leave behind your work phones, laptops, any flash drives, and company vehicle keys. If you have any company property at home, it must be returned immediately. Failure to do so will result in criminal charges. I stared at them coldly. I'm sure these officers will ensure these requirements are met, I said. The officers nodded, smiling slightly, as the 3 stunned employees gathered their belongings. Then began the walk of shame as they slowly made their way through the office, heads down, still in tears, toward the elevators. I could hear Sarah's faint voice, pleading, I want to talk to Jason. I want to see my children. If you try that, you'll spend the night in jail, John told her firmly. Crying again, Sarah asked, but where do I go? Can I go home? I want to go home. More sobbing followed as the elevator doors closed. What the hell does this all mean? Marcel whispered from behind me. I hadn't even noticed him there. I took him to my office and gave him a brief summary of the situation, leaving out the video. Some things were too personal to share right now. We discussed how to temporarily fill the recent vacancies and prepared for the short and long-term impacts this would have on the company. Once we had a plan in place, we decided to leave the rest until morning. It was just before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I needed to get out of there to collect my thoughts, and frankly, I was starving. I stepped outside and took a deep breath. I pulled out my phone and hit the speed dial. Hello, love, came a soft, soothing voice on the other end, instantly making me smile. After a short conversation, I started walking toward the city center, stopping at a florist and a cafe along the way. I needed her now, to calm my soul and feel safe again. When I entered her building, I headed to her quiet, private room. She greeted me with a warm smile, as graceful as ever, and approached me with that familiar, gentle touch. Her kiss, as always, took my breath away. God, I love my wife, I thought, as I held her tightly and told her everything that had happened that morning. She listened, tears in her eyes, as I held her close. All the while, I wondered, where's Jason? How is he? Meanwhile, Karen hurried to catch up with her brother Patrick as they approached the front door of their home. Coming back from school was always a good feeling, especially when they knew there'd be snacks waiting in the fridge. But as they stepped inside, they noticed something was off. The door was unlocked, and there was an odd smell in the air. Daddy? Karen gasped, her voice filled with concern. Patrick turned to see his sister staring wide-eyed into their father's office. There, lying disheveled on his side, was their father. Papa! Patrick shouted as he rushed to his father's side, relieved to hear his dad's heavy breathing. Leaning over him, Patrick checked to make sure his airway was clear, just as he had been taught in first aid class, and left him resting safely on his side. Oh my God! Mom! Karen's tense and confused voice broke through the silence. Patrick's heart raced as he turned to look at her. What now? Karen's horrified gaze was fixed on something behind him. He hesitated, but knew he had to see it. Slowly turning, he saw the image on the computer screen, his mother, involved in something that made him sick to his stomach. Patrick rushed to the screen and quickly turned it off, breathing heavily, trying to suppress the wave of emotions. He glanced back at his father, noticing the empty bottle nearby. His mind swirled with confusion and pain. Suddenly, Karen rushed to him and hugged him tightly, sobbing into his chest. Her tears distracted Patrick from the chaos in his mind and helped him focus on what needed to be done. Holding Karen with one arm, he picked up the phone with the other and called for an ambulance. After that, he contacted his uncle Brad, telling him what they had found before hanging up and sitting on the floor next to his father, Karen still clinging to him. The next 30 minutes were a blur for the children as paramedics arrived to attend to their father. Uncle Brad arrived shortly after and did his best to shield them from the unfolding situation, but it was too late. The children had already seen more than any child their age should ever witness. Brad knew the emotional damage would have to be addressed in the future. He called his wife, calming her down before taking the children with him in the ambulance to the hospital, where Elizabeth was set to meet them. "Damn it, Jason," Brad thought. "Why did you do this? You told me you were fine. I should have known better." Jason and Elizabeth had lost their father when Jason was 14 and Elizabeth was 11. Their mother, struggling with alcohol and medication, passed away 4 years later. Their father had left them for a woman 10 years younger, and before he left, he had been emotionally and physically abusive to them all, especially their mother. This devastated the family, and Jason had to grow up fast, taking on the parental role that had been left vacant. Both children despised their father, and that disdain extended to anyone who betrayed their partners, having seen how infidelity destroyed their mother. Jason had never touched alcohol, vowing to never follow in his father's footsteps. He dedicated his life to caring for Elizabeth, foregoing a social life to ensure she was safe. To Elizabeth, Jason was her world, her brother, her best friend, her father, and, in many ways, her mother, all in one. At the hospital, Brad and Elizabeth took the children aside while the medical staff treated Jason. The kids were visibly upset, still processing everything they had seen. Once Jason was stabilized, he was moved to a private room where visitors were allowed, though he remained unconscious. When he wakes up, he'll be fine. He might have a bad headache and feel unwell for a while, but otherwise, he'll recover, the young doctor on duty reassured them. We had to pump his stomach, so his throat will be sore for a few days. We're also keeping him on fluids and electrolytes. Thank you, doctor, Elizabeth sighed in relief, pulling her children close. After the doctor left, they gathered around Jason's bedside. Karen refused to let go of his hand, while Patrick stood behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders to comfort her. Elizabeth and Brad stood by Jason's side as well, and Elizabeth leaned in close, whispering something softly to her brother and kissing him on the cheek. The bond between them was strong, so strong that Brad had come to accept that part of his wife's heart would always belong to Jason. He understood, knowing all too well the trauma they had endured together. "Brad, I'm going to grab us some drinks, okay?" Elizabeth said quietly. Brad nodded and patted her hand before she left the room. He looked at the two devastated children and felt a deep sense of responsibility to protect them. As he headed down the corridor to the front desk, where he could buy some juice for the kids and coffee for Elizabeth, he heard a commotion ahead. When he arrived, he was shocked and then angry when he saw Sarah standing there, crying, with everyone around her watching. Brad walked up to John and Mike, the officers on duty. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Sergeant," John replied, "this person," he spat the word, "seems to think she has the right to see the man she's responsible for putting in the hospital." Contempt dripped from his voice, and Sarah only cried harder as the surrounding staff began to grow concerned. Seeing the situation escalating, Brad decided to intervene before it turned into a spectacle. He grabbed Sarah by the elbow, perhaps a bit too roughly, and led her into a small room off to the side of the reception area, where sensitive news was often delivered. He guided her to a chair and sat down across from her as she continued to sob, though his years of police work had made it easy for him to remain calm and detached. Eventually, Sarah quieted down, and Brad spoke in a low, neutral tone. "What are you doing here, Sarah? Haven't you done enough? How did you even know he was here?" "I got a call from the hospital," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Is he okay? What happened?" "I need to see him, Brad. I need to explain. I need to tell him I'm sorry. I love him. I want to see my children. Can I see my kids, Brad, please?" Sarah muttered, her voice trembling. I couldn't help but scoff. "Do you love him?" Are you seriously saying that after everything that's come to light? Is this what you call love? I shook my head in disgust. Just go, Sarah. No one wants to hear about your so-called love and devotion right now. Please, Brad. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix this. Is he okay? She was almost pleading now. He drank himself unconscious, but thankfully, he's going to recover. Unfortunately, your children know everything. They saw footage of you and your lovers on Jason's computer when they found him. At this, Sarah let out a groan, burying her face in her hands as she cried. My children saw that? They'll never forgive me. Everything is ruined. I've been so foolish. How did it go this far? It's a nightmare. And what that awful man Derek did. I'll never forgive him. Her words caught my attention. What do you mean, Sarah? What did Derek do? You saw what happened, Brad. I didn't even know he was going to be there. I muttered. Can you at least tell me why, Sarah? Why did you throw everything away? She looked at me, tears still streaming down her face. Her eyes were red and swollen, her cheeks flushed with emotion, and her once perfect hair was now disheveled. I used to think Sarah was strikingly beautiful, 57 years old with long hair, sparkling brown eyes, and flawless skin. Even after 2 kids, she had a figure that would turn heads, but none of that mattered to me anymore. All I could see was the wreckage of everything we had lost. Sarah sighed deeply and began to explain, trying to make sense of it all. It all started when Claire and I were working on a project at the company. We had spent weeks preparing, and once it was completed, she brought out a bottle of champagne to celebrate. We were exhausted, but also relieved. We talked about work, life, even personal things as we relaxed. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I don't drink much, especially living with Jason, so after a couple of glasses, I was already feeling it. As we talked, I spilled my drink on my blouse, and Claire took me to the restroom to clean up. That's when things got out of hand. She made a few comments, jokes really, and before I knew it, she was helping me out of my blouse. I stayed silent, letting her continue. She shifted uncomfortably. It was all so unexpected. I didn't know what to make of it, but in the moment, I felt safe with her, like it wasn't really a betrayal because it wasn't another man. I even told myself it wasn't taking anything away from Jason or the kids. I thought it was harmless. But that's when the problems started. Sarah's voice grew quieter as she continued. It wasn't just a one-time thing. Claire and I got closer, and it became a regular thing. I dealt with the guilt by convincing myself that since I wasn't cheating with another man or taking time away from Jason or the kids, it was harmless. But problems started to arise when Claire suggested having an early lunch outside the office and took me to a small motel nearby. She became overly affectionate, and we barely made it into the room before things escalated. I recognized the place from the photographs in Jason's video, not from the first time, but from one of the later visits. How could I have been so careless? In total, we went to that motel 5 times, and each encounter left me feeling more unsettled. Claire, however, became more demanding, pushing the boundaries of what I was comfortable with. Then, things came to a head 3 weeks ago. It was a Saturday morning, and Jason was away on a golf outing with some friends, leaving the house quiet. My children were with their grandparents, and I planned to spend the day alone. Around noon, there was a knock at the door. Claire? I was shocked to see her standing there with a bag in hand and a playful smile. What are you doing here? I asked as she walked in. Are we alone? She asked with a grin. Yes, but you shouldn't be here. This isn't right, I replied. Despite my protests, I gave in, and we ended up in the bedroom. Things were spiraling out of control, and over the next couple of weeks, we repeated the same mistake. I became increasingly frustrated and told Claire it couldn't continue. She seemed disappointed, but we agreed to have one final meeting, knowing Jason would be out golfing again. That last time, after we had another encounter, something unexpected happened. To my shock and humiliation, Derek Wilson appeared. I was horrified. Without saying a word, I left the room, feeling utterly betrayed. I went into the shower, desperate to wash away the shame and guilt I felt. When I emerged, Claire was gone. I tore off the bed linen, erasing any trace of what had happened, and tried to focus on my children for the rest of the day. When Jason came home that evening, something felt off. He seemed distant, spending more time in his office than usual. I tried to be close to him, but he was preoccupied. The next day was no different. Jason was avoiding me, and my unease grew. I wondered if he could sense what I had done, if my guilt was written all over me. After all, he had known me for 16 years. I worried constantly, wondering if he could see the truth in my eyes and whether that was why he was pulling away. And now, here we are. Brad, I don't know how I could have been so foolish. How did I let it get to this point? I've thrown everything away, my husband, my family, my life. The kids must hate me. Tears ran down Sarah's face as she finished her story, shaking her head in disbelief. I looked at her, feeling a mixture of anger and pity. Part of me wanted to yell at her for her selfishness. She had truly thrown everything away, and the consequences were painful but well-deserved. I think you should leave now, Sarah, I said, my tone firm. Your presence here will only make things worse. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with regret. Please tell Jason and the kids that I'm sorry, that I love them. Please, Brad. I won't do that, Sarah. None of them are ready to hear from you, not now. I won't even tell them you were here, it'll only hurt them more. Her face fell as she slowly stood up. I understand, she whispered, walking toward the door. I followed her, intending to walk her out, when suddenly I heard a voice behind us. What are you doing here? We saw what you did. How could you do this to Dad? You almost killed him. I hate you. We both turned to see Patrick standing in the hallway, his face red with anger. He was yelling at his mother, his emotions raw and unfiltered. Sarah collapsed to the floor, shaking and crying. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry, she whispered, broken and trembling. I hate you. I never want to see you again, ever, he screamed as Mike and John picked him up and led him back to his father's room. I hate you were the last words we heard as they turned the corner. I looked down at Sarah, who was now curled up in a ball on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Before I could act, a couple of nurses arrived and gently helped her up as she muttered incoherently. They disappeared into a nearby observation room, while I stood there staring at the closed door. I glanced around the reception area, and many shocked and puzzled faces were looking back at me. Taking a deep breath, I made my way back to Jason's room. By now, Patrick had likely told everyone that Sarah was here, making everything even worse for all of us. I walked past Mike and told him, Sarah's still here. Keep me informed about her, and make sure she stays away from them. No problem, boss. I can't believe she even came here, he muttered, continuing on his way. Mike was the one who had taken the photos of Sarah and Claire entering and leaving the motel. Jason had originally gone to see Sarah for lunch when he saw them leaving the building. He noticed how close they were acting and, sensing something was off, followed them to the motel. He watched, stunned, as Claire kissed Sarah and things got intimate between them. This led to a bit of undercover work by myself, John, and Mike, which eventually revealed the pattern of their visits to the motel, as well as Claire's first visit to Sarah's house. It wasn't difficult to gather the evidence needed, and Jason, being tech-savvy, installed several cameras in the house. The rest, as they say, is history. We got the photos, and Jason got the videos. However, none of us knew about Derek until John spotted him sneaking into the back of the house about 45 minutes after Claire arrived. At the very least, it confirmed Sarah's story that she hadn't known Derek would be involved. Still, cheating is cheating, and whether it's with a man or a woman, it breaks trust. When trust is shattered, where does that leave the relationship? I took a deep breath as I walked into Jason's room, knowing it wouldn't be easy. Surprisingly, the room was calm. Beth was sitting on one side, holding Jason's hand, while Karen sat on the other, with a tense Patrick standing behind her, softly stroking her hair. I found it a bit puzzling. John, who was leaning against the back wall, motioned me over. He's a smart boy, Brad. He knew that if Beth and Karen found out Sarah was here, they'd only get more upset, so he kept it to himself. "I'm just here for moral support," he whispered. I nodded, feeling admiration for Patrick. He was definitely his father's son. As I looked around the room, I couldn't help but think how similar this was to what Beth and Jason had experienced with their own parents, one parent's betrayal leading to the breakdown of the family, and the children being left to bear the emotional burden. A tear slipped down my cheek as I thought about how Jason might cope with this pain. No, Jason wouldn't follow the same path. This was just a desperate attempt to escape the hurt caused by betrayal. We wouldn't let this destroy him. Jason, can you hear me?" I heard a voice trying to penetrate the fog of pain in my head. Who was it? Where am I? My eyes struggled to open, and the light hurt as I did so. Someone turned it off, but my head still pounded, and my throat felt painfully dry. "Dad? Dad, are you awake?" "Oh, Dad, you scared me." "I'm so happy you're awake," I heard Karen sob as she squeezed my hand. "Oh, Jason, you idiot," Beth's voice broke through, filled with emotion. She was nearby, crying and holding my other hand. "I'll get the doctor," I recognized John's voice as the door opened and closed. "Damn, my head hurts," I groaned, just as a straw was placed between my lips. "Serves you right, big brother." "I should slap you for scaring us like that," Beth scolded, but I could hear the softness in her voice even when she was upset. "Don't you dare smile at me." "I can't lose you," she said, hugging me tightly. Karen and Patrick soon joined in, expressing a mix of joy and anger. "Sorry," I whispered, feeling ashamed of everything I had apparently put them through. The doctor soon came in, checked me over, and announced that I could go home later that day once the medication had finished and I was properly hydrated. After he left, we all sat in silence, the elephant in the room still looming over us. I looked around at my children, and tears began to well up in my eyes. Beth glanced at me, her expression a mixture of anger and relief, as if she couldn't decide which emotion was stronger. Brad, always solid and calm, appeared a bit cautious, clearly aware of where my mind was drifting. We spoke quietly for a while, but I noticed Patrick was unusually silent and still carried a lot of tension. I spent a lot of time apologizing for scaring everyone and reassuring them that I wasn't going to do anything that reckless again. Eventually, a few chuckles filled the room as my stomach growled loudly. "Looks like I'm ready to eat," I announced with a grin. Brad volunteered to get something light from the cafeteria for me, along with snacks for everyone else. It was a good idea, given how I felt. I wasn't sure I could handle anything too heavy. Plus, since my sister and the kids weren't going to leave me alone anytime soon, this was the only way I was going to get fed. Brad left Jason's room to grab something light, maybe a sandwich, since he knew from experience that some food was necessary after tough situations. He also wanted to check on Sarah's whereabouts. If she was still at the hospital, it would be important to get her out before Jason was discharged. The thought of Sarah's presence around Jason, the kids, or Beth was unthinkable, especially for Beth, who might want to confront her directly. Brad smirked to himself at the thought, but the situation was serious. He noticed John still sitting at the front desk, clearly taken with the attractive receptionist stationed there. Rolling his eyes, Brad walked up to him. "Having fun, buddy?" he teased, causing John to jump in surprise as the receptionist giggled. "God, Sarge, don't sneak up on me like that," John exclaimed. Brad grinned. "I see you're making sure we won't have the same problems as before, huh?" John shrugged sheepishly, and Brad glanced at the receptionist's pretty brown eyes before getting back to business. "Where's the problem now?" he asked, losing the playful tone. John nodded to the right. "She's in the room over there. Looks like she's dealing with a lot of stress and anxiety," he said with obvious sarcasm. Brad sighed. "Jason's going to be discharged in a couple of hours, so make sure she stays put. I don't want them crossing paths. I'll let you know when we're ready to leave, and I'll need you to check if she's still there." "No problem, Brad. I've got handcuffs if needed," John joked with a grin. Brad shook his head. "Yeah, well, don't do anything stupid," he warned before heading off to get the snacks. Back in the room, Jason smiled as he took a bite of a simple cheese sandwich. "It's amazing how good this tastes," he sighed, washing it down with some cold water. "Are you feeling better, Daddy?" asked his little girl, her voice full of concern. "Yeah, baby, much better," Jason replied, though he could still see the sadness and fear in her eyes. His heart ached, knowing he had scared her so badly. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to worry you," he whispered. Her brows furrowed, and her lips quivered as tears welled up. "Don't ever do that again, Daddy. I can't lose you," she said softly, tears trickling down her face. Jason wiped them away and slowly tried to get out of bed. "Where are you going?" Karen almost screamed, alarmed. Baby, Daddy just needs to go to the bathroom," Jason said, a little embarrassed. "Oh. Let me help you," she squeaked, her face turning red. Jason raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to realize what she had just said. It only took a few seconds before she covered her face with her hands, mortified. "No, Dad, not like that," she cried, laughing through her embarrassment. Everyone burst into laughter at Karen's expense as she tried to explain herself, her face now buried in Jason's chest. "I meant I'd help you get out of bed," she clarified, her voice muffled. Jason chuckled, patting her head gently. "I know, baby. It's okay. We're all a little mean, aren't we?" "You're the meanest of them all," she replied, playfully slapping his arm with a big smile. Finally, it was time to leave. The doctor signed Jason's discharge papers, and he changed into the clothes he hadn't been wearing the day before. As he dressed, he thought about how Beth and Brad had taken the kids home the night before to let them rest, clean up, and prepare to return today. He, however, felt the weight of guilt over how things had turned out. Jason had been foggy for most of the day, but as his head cleared, he started noticing something odd. His children hadn't asked why their mother wasn't there, nor did they seem surprised about his situation. They didn't ask any questions about what he had done or why, and that made him nervous. How much did they know, and how was this all affecting them? Standing by the bed with the privacy curtain drawn around him, Jason felt his emotional strength beginning to crumble. He had been holding back his feelings for the sake of his children, but it was becoming harder and harder. He was so tired, and an overwhelming sense of loneliness washed over him. He had once thought his life was perfect, but now it was gone. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the emptiness that now defined his future. His eyes closed for a moment, and painful images of his wife and her lovers flashed through his mind. Jason sobbed, dropping his head to his chest. "Oh, Jason, I'm here, honey. I'm here," Elizabeth whispered, wrapping her arms around his waist and holding him tightly. "It's going to be okay, Dad. Let's go home, all right?" one of his children said softly. Jason opened his tear-filled eyes to see the faces of two beautiful people, his wife and his daughter, both embracing him. I smiled sadly at the thought of home. What is it like now without Sarah? I'm devastated by what she did, but I loved her for 16 wonderful years. Her and no one else. We had what I thought was the perfect relationship, the perfect life. But now where am I? I'm approaching 39, thinking about divorce, possibly selling the house, joint custody, and maybe starting over with someone new. Why did she do this? Why wasn't I enough for her? "Come on, Dad, it's time to go." Patrick's firm voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I smiled to myself, realizing how lucky I was to have these kids. We all walked into the house, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet and empty it felt. The smell of pine filled the air, which confused me at first. "I had to clean up some mess in your office," Beth said quietly, squeezing my hand. "Oh. I see. Sorry about that," I groaned, feeling the weight of everything again. It was already after lunch, so we went to the kitchen where everyone grabbed something to eat. Sitting at the table, I finally had to ask, "Patrick, Karen, how much do you know?" They both tensed, exchanging glances, then looked down at the table, avoiding my eyes. I could tell they didn't want to discuss it. "Jason, is this the right time?" Beth asked softly. "I think it is," I replied. "I need to know what they understand so I can figure out how to move forward. Besides, you and Brad being here for support is important." Beth and Brad exchanged a glance, and Brad nodded, squeezing Beth's hand. I looked back at the kids, and Patrick spoke first, his voice a mixture of emotions. We know Mom cheated on you, Dad. We saw the computer screen when we found you after school. My head fell into my hands, and the tears came again. Oh God, I'm so sorry you had to see that. I never wanted you to. The weight of it all hit me. They saw what their mother had done. They found me at my lowest. Maybe this is going to get even worse now, I thought, glancing up at them. Their eyes were full of sadness. It's okay, Dad. We understand why you did it, Karen whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. Yeah, because Mom is a cheater and she's trying to destroy us the same way Grandpa did to Grandma. I hate her. I hope she... Patrick shouted, but he trailed off, standing abruptly and running upstairs. A loud slam of his door echoed through the house. We all sat in stunned silence for a moment. Karen was crying now, and she jumped into my lap. Beth and Brad exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to say or do. I held my daughter close, trying to soothe her pain while grappling with my own. It was hard enough dealing with Sarah's betrayal, but I hadn't been prepared for how much my kids knew, and how much they were suffering too. Damn it, Sarah. Did you ever think about anyone else when you did this? I knocked gently on Patrick's door. Son, can we talk? There was silence, then a growl that I took as permission. I opened the door and saw him lying face down on the bed, his head buried under a pillow. I sat beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. Come on, buddy. I know you don't want to talk, but we need to. Unfortunately, this isn't going away. After a few moments, he slowly turned over, staring at the ceiling. I saw tears in his eyes, but he was trying hard to stay strong. How could she do this to us, Dad? How could she be like that? He asked, his voice full of fury. Stop, Patrick, I said softly. I know you're angry, but she's still your mother. She loves you and Karen. How can you say that, Dad? How can you protect her after what she did? Don't you hate her? I hate her. I never want to see her again. She cheated on all of us, not just you. Karen and I will never forget what we saw. He rubbed his face, trying to push away the painful memories. I wish you hadn't seen that, son. You didn't deserve it, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But this is our situation now, and we have to handle it as best we can. Things are going to be different. We'll be getting a divorce, probably selling the house, and you and Karen will have to spend time with both me and your mom. No way, Dad. I'm not talking to her. I don't ever want to see her again. I hate her, he said bitterly. She's still your mother, Patrick. You need to remember that, I said firmly. He didn't respond, just rolled over and pulled the pillow over his head. The conversation was over. I patted his shoulder, squeezed it gently, and walked out with a heavy heart. I love you, son, I said quietly as I left the room. He muttered something in response, but I couldn't make it out. I closed the door, feeling utterly defeated. I hadn't even figured out my own emotions, let alone how to deal with my children's. Damn it, I really messed everything up. It was so foolish to lose control and get drunk, now look where it's led. The kids are suffering, and I guess Sarah isn't the only one being selfish here. Over the next few days, I focused on calming the children and getting them back to their routines. I threw myself into work to keep my mind occupied and made a vow to myself that I would never let my children down again. These are adult issues that need to be dealt with, and I am determined to undo the damage as much as possible. I took the time to update my financial arrangements, removing my name from joint accounts and moving money into accounts solely in my name. I split the funds equally and took steps to protect my business. The joint credit cards were canceled and paid off, and Sarah will now manage her own finances. It's painful to have to sort out my life like this. I couldn't just throw away all the love I once had for someone. During this time, I admit I cried several times while sitting in the car in random parking lots. I met with my divorce lawyer, and we began the process, citing adultery as the reason. We filed the paperwork with Sarah's parents since I didn't know where she was living. Brad told me about an incident at the hospital involving Sarah, and while I was saddened by her distress, I was also relieved that she had begun to understand the pain she had caused. It took a few days, but I felt like I was on the right track, despite the weeks of preparation for this inevitability. The video I saw was unexpected and more painful than I anticipated. It was clear that this wasn't something Sarah had planned or wanted. The hardest moments came at night, lying in the new king-size bed I had bought, replacing the queen we used to share. The bed felt too large for me alone, and I missed having my wife beside me. I knew I was being foolish, but I still loved her and felt an emptiness now that she was gone. 2 weeks passed before my lawyer called with news that Sarah's lawyer had insisted on and gained access to the children. We agreed on a schedule where Sarah would pick them up at 10 a.m. on Saturday and return them on Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. When I told the kids, Karen was quiet, while Patrick was more vocal. I spoke with them about the need to try to forgive their mother and maintain a relationship with her. I reassured them that she loved and missed them. On the day it was supposed to happen, I was very nervous. My heart raced, I sweated, and my stomach churned. I hadn't seen Sarah for 2 weeks and was unsure how I would react. When she arrived, she looked nervous as she got out of the car, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. She rang the bell, and I just waited. I saw Karen standing hesitantly with her overnight bag, looking so sad and fragile it nearly broke my heart. I didn't know where Patrick was, but assumed he was in his room. The bell rang again, and with sweaty palms and a tight chest, I opened the door. Seeing Sarah for the first time since she was so drunk and tearful 2 weeks ago was overwhelming. I heard her sigh as the door opened, and we stood there, unable to find the right words. My heart stopped, and my mind was in turmoil. I realized then that I still loved her, and I resented myself for that. A tear slowly rolled down my cheek as I looked at her. Her eyes, red with tears, reflected the pain she knew she had caused. She lowered her head and sobbed, her breathing ragged. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." She looked at me with pleading eyes. I blinked a few times, trying to calm down despite the pain in my chest. I called out to the children, "Karen, Patrick, your mother is here. It's time to go." I turned away, walking back into the house and leaving Sarah crying behind me. I took a few deep breaths, sighed heavily, and ran my fingers through my hair. Karen walked towards me slowly, and I hugged her tightly. "Have a good time with Mommy, sweetie. See you tomorrow. Love you." "I love you too, Dad. You're not mad that I'm going, are you?" "Why would I be angry, honey?" I asked, confused. "I don't want you to think you're betraying me by going with her. You love your mom, and she loves you very much. That's never wrong." "Okay. I'll try not to have too much chocolate," she said with a smile, hugging me back. "I love you too, baby," I said, smiling. "And don't worry, I'll always call you Dad." I turned to escort Karen out the door and saw Sarah standing at the entrance, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered as Karen approached her. I was a bit saddened that Karen didn't try to hug her mother, and Sarah seemed to sense it, nodding her head and murmuring something quietly under her breath. "Patrick, where are you?" "It's time to go," I called out upstairs. Patrick came down the stairs looking as hostile as he had recently. I noticed he didn't have a bag as he walked past me and out the door, ignoring his mother. I thought he was heading to her car, but as we all exited the house, we saw him get on his bike and ride away. "Patrick, what are you doing?" I shouted. "Your mother is here to take you for the weekend." "Not interested," was his only reply as he left. I was a bit stunned but not too surprised. From the beginning, he had been very firm about not wanting to see his mother. Karen took my hand, listening to Sarah cry loudly as she sat on the step by the door. I looked at Karen, then at her mother. "Dad, I don't want to go alone. What if Mom brings those people and something happens? I don't want to be there for that. I won't go." "Please don't force me," Karen pleaded, almost in hysteria. I heard a loud sigh and then a painful groan. When I looked over Karen's head, I saw Sarah collapse on the ground, crying openly. It seemed that hearing what our daughter said had devastated her. I was overwhelmed with anger and sadness. It felt as if Sarah had taken everything from me and from us. "Mom would never do anything like that when you're with her, honey," I said, trying to remain calm despite my own turmoil. "Oh God, Karen, I'll never do anything like that again." I'm so sorry for what I did. Please, I love you so much. I'll never do that to you again, Sarah pleaded, almost sound as she spoke. Karen stood in my arms, glaring at her mother. You did this to Dad. You should have loved him too, but you didn't. Did you, Mom? She said, breaking away from my embrace and rushing past her crying mother, who was lying on the ground. I watched silently as she disappeared before I heard the door slam, leaving only Sarah's sobbing to fill the void. I honestly didn't know what to do next or how to handle the emotional upheaval caused by someone having a breakdown on our lawn. I couldn't believe I wasn't experiencing this myself. I had cried, screamed, and begged for it all to be untrue, but it was real. Every morning, the pain and the reality of it all were there. I had to be strong for my children, even as I felt the weight of it all. I clenched my fists and then relaxed as the tension built within me. I looked at Sarah, took a deep breath, and approached her. A part of me felt heartache for what we had become. The innocence of my children was lost, and my life felt empty. Standing over the woman I once loved, tears streamed down my face. I hope you're happy. Maybe your lovers can ease your pain, I said, my voice devoid of emotion as I looked at her. Sarah didn't even look at me as she cried louder. Go away, I finally said, returning to the house and closing the door. Nearly an hour later, I noticed that her sobbing had stopped and heard her car pull out of the driveway. During this time, I spoke with Karen, and after many tears, she decided that ice cream and a movie would be the best way to pass the time. Patrick was gone most of the day and returned late in the afternoon. We sat around the table, discussing what had happened that morning. After much convincing, I was able to calm them both down and get them to agree to try and be kind to their mother when she picked them up in 2 weeks. Over the next 2 weeks, things slowly returned to normal. The kids went back to school, and I went back to work. My staff managed the workload while I sorted things out. I ignored many messages and calls from friends and family as the news spread, and took time to respond to as many people as possible. Daniel and I had several long conversations as I navigated the ups and downs of the situation. He and his wife, Donna, were a great support, though they struggled to understand why Sarah had acted as she did. Beth and Brad were regular visitors to both my home and work. They were worried but supportive. Beth, in particular, seemed to relax a bit, though she made it clear she would never completely stop caring or being vigilant. She said she loves me too much and relies on me too much to completely stop caring. I just wish she'd consider starting a family with Brad before it's too late. I also knew that what happened to our parents had a huge impact on her and made her afraid that the same would happen to her. It took her a long time to trust someone, but Brad managed to break through her defenses and win her heart. Sarah's next weekend came, and again, I couldn't look at her without a tear sliding down my cheek. Sarah simply looked at the ground and waited patiently for the children. Although it was clearly uncomfortable, the children got into her car, and I watched them drive away. Karen looked down at her niece, and Patrick just stared out the window, bitterly. Now I had 2 days alone, and I felt even more lost than before. I realized that I was relying on the support and love of my children in the same way they seemed to rely on me. I decided to go to the office on Saturday to catch up on some work and spent Sunday doing minor repairs around the house. I really enjoyed this time and felt good about getting a lot of those little things done that I had been putting off for months. I was cleaning up and watching TV when I heard Sarah's car pull into the driveway. I opened the door and watched them all get out of the car together. Patrick just walked right up to me and said hi as he entered the house, ignoring his mother. I saw defeat on Sarah's face as she sighed and then turned to Karen, who stood a few steps away. Sarah stepped forward with the obvious intention of hugging her. "Bye, Mom," Karen said quickly, walking towards the house. Sarah called after her, "Bye, honey, I love you." Karen stopped, looked at her mother with curiosity, almost as if asking a question, before continuing into the house. She gave me a hug and a kiss on the cheek, saying, "Hey Dad, I missed you." Sarah just stood there, motionless, staring after her until a wave of emotion crossed her face. Slowly, she looked at me, and our eyes met. Was it worth it? I sighed, shaking my head as I turned and walked toward the house. "I'm sorry, Jason." "I'm so sorry," she shouted after me as I closed the door. The children told me that their mother was living with a friend and sharing a house because she couldn't afford her own place. It was small, and the children had to share a room because Patrick refused to sleep in his mother's bed, so the girls could sleep together. Patrick made it clear that he didn't want to risk anything, which, of course, led to Sarah's tears. Karen seemed happier sharing a room with her brother under the circumstances. Sarah had been suspended without pay when all this came out. I didn't know the friend, but the kids said she seemed nice enough and reassured me that it wasn't a problem. Although I shouldn't have cared, I still worried a bit. Our savings were low when we split up due to recent renovations in the kitchen, so we only had a few thousand each, which mostly went toward paying lawyers. I assumed Sarah had a similar situation. Fortunately, I had my own business and a stable income thanks to it. Sarah, I was told, worked part-time as a secretary while the main employee was on maternity leave. Sarah didn't make any financial demands on me, possibly due to her guilt over what she did to our family. Life continued like this for the next few months without much change, except we were becoming a little more comfortable with each other regarding the kids. Karen softened her attitude toward her mother, and they would briefly laugh and hug when they met and said goodbye. Even Patrick said hello and goodbye, though he still refused to touch her. I could see it was hurting Sarah, but she deserved it, right? One day, after dropping off the kids, Sarah followed Karen to the house and approached me at the door. "Jason," she said carefully, "is there a chance that we could talk sometime, just the two of us?" I stood there in shock, not knowing how to respond. My heart pounded, and my breathing almost stopped as I blinked blankly at her. Was she serious? I didn't want to talk to her. I had a big question I wanted to ask, but getting an answer seemed pointless since it wouldn't change anything. Sarah just stood there, waiting patiently, looking for something in my eyes. I finally blinked and sighed, letting out a breath slowly as I stepped back and closed the door, leaving her standing outside. I heard a sob and a muffled "I love you" before I turned and walked further into the house, sitting quietly at the kitchen table. What the hell? Sarah didn't try to talk to me again, but 3 weeks later, when we attended our first divorce hearing, her lawyer petitioned the court for counseling. Although my lawyer protested loudly that I had no interest in trying to save the marriage, the judge ordered us to undergo counseling and let the psychologist decide how long the sessions would continue based on the results. Essentially, I was required to sit in a room with Sarah and listen to her apologies. I didn't need to talk and didn't want to participate in anything that implied my agreement with it. That's exactly how our first session went. The psychologist, Megan, was a pleasant woman about 50 with slightly gray hair, somewhat motherly in demeanor. She explained why we were there and hoped we could take positive steps toward forgiveness and moving forward for everyone's sake. I maintained a neutral expression for most of the session, saying nothing. Some might call it childish behavior, but I didn't want to be there, I was forced to be there. As expected, Sarah followed the script. She cried, apologized, and said it was a mistake and that she still loved me. When she tried to explain how it happened, it was the first time I reacted. I stood up, looked at my estranged wife with disgust, glanced at the psychologist with contempt, and walked out the door. I heard both women try to call me back, but I wasn't interested in hearing Sarah justify her actions. 2 weeks later, on the strong advice of my lawyer, I saw a psychologist again, this time alone. "So, Jason, you seemed a little upset the last time I saw you. I hope you're feeling a bit calmer today," she said with a warm smile. I sat and looked at her with the same blank, indifferent expression I had 2 weeks prior. She waited patiently, clearly expecting me to answer, but I had no intention of doing so. The sooner everyone realized that I wasn't going to be part of this farce and allowed me to get a divorce, the better it would be for everyone involved. After a few minutes of her waiting expectantly, she sighed heavily and made a note in the book on her lap. She continued talking about things like closure, forgiveness, the children's relationship with their mother, co-parenting, etc. But as soon as she started talking about how much Sarah loved me, I left the office again. It took 2 more sessions, during which I refused to speak, for the psychologist to finally give up. I didn't do anything wrong. Sarah ruined our relationship. She cheated on me, broke her vows, and took trust and love out of my life. She did all of this and more, not me. But it seemed like I was being blamed and suffering for a crime I didn't commit. My children and I were victims, and no one would change my mind about this. Finally, we returned to court, and the judge was critical of my refusal to participate in sessions with the psychologist. While I stood there with a blank expression, my lawyer conveyed to him that I had done nothing wrong and did not want anything to do with Sarah or her explanations. The longer this went on, the harder my position became. It was clear that I was not going to consider reconciling with my ex-wife. The images of her betrayal stayed with me, burned into my memory, and came to me every time I closed my eyes. I was exhausted and just wanted it all to end so I could get back to some semblance of normal life and move forward. I'm still relatively young, and during all of this, I went back to the gym, which was a lifesaver. I needed to let go of my anger, and by doing so, I lost weight and improved my fitness a bit. After the divorce was finalized, I can't say that life became better for me or for the children. We persevered bravely, but there were many times when one or more of us were clearly upset about something from our old lives. I kept the house and my business because Sarah wanted very little, likely due to her guilt over what happened. I rearranged some finances to give her half the equity in the house, allowing her to find a decent 3-bedroom apartment to rent and modestly furnish it. The children told me that Karen softened her position towards her mother, but Patrick firmly stood his ground. He couldn't forgive Sarah for what she did to me or to our once happy family. I knew this hurt Sarah deeply, as she and Patrick had a strong relationship before all of this. I heard through the grapevine that Claire's husband also kicked her out, but he didn't handle custody well, and Claire ended up with custody. I felt sorry for him, as the innocent victim seemed to be punished the most. Derek, on the other hand, didn't cope well at all. His wife kicked him out immediately and filed for divorce, ensuring that she and her 2 brothers made his life difficult. I dropped the lawsuit against Daniel and his business but continued with the lawsuits against CLA and Derek for their role in the situation. Claire and Derek admitted to a long-term affair and pursued Sarah without her knowledge. The judge was a bit lenient but still awarded several $1,000s in damages. Derek, after settling his divorce, was financially ruined by the award. I didn't really need that money. I was just being vindictive, ensuring that those who helped destroy my marriage and family would pay for what they did and have little opportunity to do it to someone else. I met up with Claire's ex-husband Leonard, and we had a few drinks together. He had tea and I had tea, no more alcohol for me. We discussed his financial situation, and I helped him use some of the money to set up funds for his children's education. The rest I gave him to help him get back on his feet. We became good friends through all of this and still are. I also met with Derek's ex-wife, but she didn't want to take the money I received. She felt she had been compensated enough and was just glad that Derek was now struggling financially. Such things spread quickly among the upper echelons of the business world. Daniel replaced Claire, and after the trials, at my daughter's request to help her mother, who seemed to be becoming increasingly depressed, I spoke to Daniel about Sarah returning to work. Naturally, he was initially against it, but I couldn't disappoint Karen. She needed her mother, and she needed her to be happy. Thank you, Jason. I can't believe that after everything I've done, you would help me like that, Sarah nearly sobbed the week after she returned to work. I did this for our daughter, Saru. She needs her mother to be happy again, Sarah said. I know I'm just trying to cope with what I did, what I lost, what I missed. I miss you, Jason. I miss us. I miss our family, she cried as she turned to her car to pick up the kids for the weekend. Sarah wasn't dating anyone, as everyone had told me, and I noticed a significant drop in her weight, which was starting to worry me. She seemed more and more depressed as time went on, and even Patrick began to show signs of anxiety. I decided I needed to intervene before it became a real problem. I know a lot of people would think I was foolish, but I still loved her, and she was the mother of my children. I couldn't let her continue down this path of darkness. A few weeks later, when Sarah dropped off the kids, I said, Sarah, would you like to come over for a while? Both children looked at me in surprise at the proposal. Sarah stood there, eyes wide and mouth open in shock. I pretended to be offended. Well, if you're not interested, that's fine, I said, turning and winking at Karen with a smile. What? No, please, Jason, I'd really like to come in, Sarah said, her voice trembling as she tried not to cry. Dad, stop being so mean to Mom, Karen almost stamped her foot. I turned to give Sarah a half-smirking smile. Would you like a cold drink? It's a hot day. With a hopeful look on her face, Sarah smiled shyly. Thank you, that would be wonderful, she said, as a tear rolled down each cheek. Even now, I still thought she was the most beautiful woman, and I was tired of hating her. A lot of time had passed, and they say that time heals all wounds. I still couldn't forget, and I never will, but could I forgive? I think inviting her into what was once our family home was the start of that. It was very awkward as we all sat at the kitchen table quietly sipping our drinks. I could see the children's eyes shifting from me to Sarah to each other. Sarah sat with her shoulders slightly slumped, looking around the room, noticing the changes that had occurred over the weekend. I had repainted the house to freshen it up and make it more my own. A lot of the clutter had disappeared, and new furniture had appeared. I love what you did to the house, Jason. The new color scheme looks beautiful. I see you replaced some furniture too. Sarah tried to sound as normal as possible. I saw how much effort it took. Thank you. We like it, don't we, kids? I said. The kids chose the colors themselves, I added, and I'd like to say they helped, but you said we just get in the way and ruin everything, Karen said, rolling her eyes at me. Patrick just grinned at me. The look in his eyes suggested he knew I was worried about his mother, and that was why we were all here now. Smart kid. Mom, do you want to see my room? Karen asked. I would love to, darling, if your father doesn't mind. Sarah looked at me questioningly. Everything is fine, Karen said quietly with hope in her eyes. I paused for a moment and then smiled at my sweet little girl. Of course it's okay, honey. I turned to Sarah. Feel free to look around. Both of them nearly split their heads from the smiles that broke out when Karen grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her upstairs. Are you sure about all this, Dad? Patrick asked as we listened to Karen chatter as they walked up the stairs. I shrugged and looked at my son. I don't know, son, but look at your mother. She is wasting away from guilt and depression. You and Karen told me how sad she was and how she cried in her room all the time. I know what she did and I know I can never forget it, but she is your mother. What would it teach you and your sister if I allowed her to continue to get worse? How would you look at me if I let this fade away? What kind of person would that make me? Patrick sat silently, thinking about these things for a few minutes until we heard laughter coming from the top of the stairs as the girls came down. You did a great job decorating, Jason. I never would have thought of some of the colors you used, but they look wonderful, especially in your bedroom. I see you have a new bed too, Sarah said before a fog of sadness clouded her face. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she began to sob at the table. Karen quickly walked up to her mother and hugged her, and I handed her a tissue from a nearby box. Sarah looked at me, smiled faintly, and said, "Thank you," while wiping her face. This was the beginning of a new stage in our relationship. Sarah began dropping off the kids and staying longer and longer over the next few months, eventually staying for dinner and then for family movie night. There was no intimacy between Sarah and me during this time, but the children and I noticed a noticeable improvement in her. Over time, she seemed happier, put on some weight, and although she was thinner than before, it suited her better. I admitted that I still loved her. From time to time, she would catch me looking at her with something close to longing, as I still saw the woman I had fallen in love with. I would even blush when she caught me, and she would blush and smile shyly in return. The more time we spent together, the more comfortable I felt. Sarah, I asked one day about 18 months after my world collapsed. Yes, she replied, turning to me as she helped prepare the children's dinner after bringing them home one Sunday evening. Would you like to go out to dinner with me one night? I couldn't believe how calm I felt asking this. I think enough time had passed that I had forgiven her, and I still loved her. We spent more and more family time together, and in some ways, it was like before everything happened. When those nights ended and she went home, I always felt sad and a little lonely. We always had such a good time together, and I enjoyed her company. I watched and waited, calmly and expectantly, even nervously, for an answer. Sarah stared at me with wide eyes, her breathing quickened, and her face flushed. A few tears fell from her eyes. I watched as she hesitantly placed the knife on the cutting board and turned fully to face me. I could see many emotions on her face, but the predominant one seemed to be joy as she brought her hands to her face and cried openly. It wasn't the reaction I was hoping for, and to be honest, I was a little taken aback. Hearing their mother cry, Karen and Patrick came into the kitchen with worry on their faces. "What's happening? What happened? What did you do, Dad?" Karen asked, her voice filled with confusion. "I'm not too sure, honey. I just asked your mom if she wanted to go out to dinner one night, and she started crying. I'm not sure if that's a yes or a no," I said with a grin. Sarah's head shot up. "Yes, you big fool," she said, almost irritably, then walked up to me, hugged me around the waist, and pressed her body against mine. I felt her body tremble with excitement, and her tears began to soak through my shirt. I hugged her, and Sarah began to sob louder and hugged me tightly. It was the first time we had embraced like this in a long while. I could feel that she was pleased to be in my arms again. Like Sarah, I hadn't dated anyone, and I missed it. I felt her warmth, her presence against my chest. Tears streamed down Karen's cheeks, and her smile beamed at me. Even Patrick nodded approvingly and grinned back. I leaned over and kissed the top of Sarah's head, inhaling her scent, the special scent that only she can create. This was home. My hands ran up and down her back as she pressed herself closer to me, trying to merge with my body. It felt good, and I have to admit that after over 18 months of not having such a warm and close connection, I reacted in a way I hadn't expected. I heard a small sigh followed by a soft sound as Sarah looked at me hopefully. I blushed and licked my lips because my mouth was dry. I looked at her for a couple of moments, kissed her forehead, and then broke the hug. "Well, how about Friday? I'll pick you up at 7. Wiping her eyes and smiling widely, Sarah nodded. "Great. Thank you, Jason." That evening, dinner was noticeably lighter, and I noticed that Sarah looked at me with adoration from time to time, sometimes with eyes close to tears. Karen and Patrick noticed this and smiled for the first time in a very long time. The week seemed to drag on, and as Friday approached, I started to get really nervous, much like that first date back in high school. I began to worry about what to wear, what to say, and how to act. I had long ago forgiven Sarah, and although I could never forget, I still loved her deeply. I knew her so well and for so long that I couldn't let her go. I understood that she had hurt me, and that pain resurfaced in quiet moments. However, as time went on, the pain lessened. We started talking again, and the children became much happier and more balanced when they saw their parents getting along. We had all seen therapists and counselors, and I felt good about my life again, something I honestly never thought I would be able to do. I took a deep breath and calmed down as I stood there. My mind began to wander, and some uninvited thoughts crept in, leaving me wondering if I was doing the right thing. Was this a mistake? Should I move on and start over? Starting over was a scary thought. I stood quietly, contemplating all the possibilities of my life and what I wanted, where I wanted to go, and most importantly, who I wanted to go there with. My hand began to sweat holding a small bouquet of flowers, Sarah's favorite. Time seemed to fly by quickly. I looked at my watch and realized that I had been standing there for more than 15 minutes, thinking through the problem. I took another calming breath and raised my hand to knock on the door. As soon as my hand touched the door, it swung open, and Sarah stood there, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you changed your mind. I thought this time you would leave me forever. I was so scared that you thought it was a mistake," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Please do not go. Please don't leave me, Jason. Please, this will kill me." Sarah almost collapsed into my arms. I entered her apartment and closed the door behind us. "It's okay, Sarah. I'm here. We are here. I love you, Sarah. I've always loved you, and I want us to try again. Will this be okay?" I said softly. Sarah looked at me, searching for a lie or a game, but she knew it wasn't. "Yes, yes, yes. Oh God, yes," Sarah cried as she hugged me. We shared a passionate kiss, and the connection between us was stronger than ever. That evening, instead of dinner, we focused on reconnecting deeply. What followed was a period of intense and meaningful reconnection. We were freer with each other, exploring our relationship and deepening our bond. Initially, Sarah was very accommodating to my ideas, but once I realized it was mainly due to guilt, I knew we needed to address it. We eventually went to couples counseling, which helped resolve these issues. Sarah became more comfortable asserting her own boundaries, and I was glad for that. It showed she was becoming more herself. At the end of that year, I asked Sarah to move in with me and the kids. She was overwhelmed with emotion, and we became a family again. In some ways, we were stronger because of it. We continued to see a counselor for several months after this major event in our lives. We faced various challenges as we embarked on this new beginning, but we were determined to improve things as we moved forward. Will we get married again? I restyled her last engagement ring, so I guess fingers crossed. What do you think of our story today? I think the husband did the right thing by watching all of Jason's videos. What was your impression? Let me know in the comments. See you in the comments.